This week we're moving into something that sits underneath almost every strong story: narrative structure. Not the surface details like characters or setting, but the framework that holds the whole story up and gives it direction and momentum. We're going to look at how stories are built, not to make them rigid or formulaic, but to make them work. Structure isn't about limiting creativity. It's about supporting it, so your ideas land with more impact. When a story feels satisfying, emotionally powerful and well-paced, there's almost always a clear narrative shape behind it, even if the reader never consciously notices it. Today we'll explore that shape, learn how to recognize it, and practice applying it to your own writing. We are going to explore how strong narratives are shaped and supported from the inside out. We'll start with the basic story arc, beginning, middle, and end, and look at what each part actually does in a working story, not just where it sits on the page. Then we'll look at two widely used structure models: the 3-act structure and the hero's journey. You've probably experienced both many times in books and films. Today you'll learn how to recognize them and use them intentionally. We'll also spend time on conflict and stakes, because structure on its own isn't enough. A story needs pressure and consequence. Without tension, structure becomes a sequence of events, and events alone don't hold a reader's attention for long. By the end of this session, you should be able to step back from your own idea or draft and map the overall shape of the story, where it starts, where it turns, where it peaks, and what changes by the end. That's a powerful tool for any writer. A narrative arc is simply the shape of a story, how it grows, develops, and builds over time. Think of it as the story's journey from its starting point to its ending point, not just what happens, but how and why it progresses. In a strong narrative, events don't feel random or dropped in by chance. Each moment should be doing some kind of work, pushing the plot forward, revealing something about a character, increasing the pressure, or deepening the consequences. Even quieter scenes should still be moving something underneath. A helpful question to ask is, what changes because of this moment? If nothing changes, the scene may not be pulling its weight yet. When a story has a clear arc, the reader feels a sense of direction and momentum. They may not be able to explain the structure, but they can feel that the story is going somewhere and building towards something meaningful. That feeling of movement is what keeps readers engaged and turning pages. Can anyone think of a story they love and describe what changes from start to end, either in the situation or in the character? At its simplest level, most stories follow a 3-part movement: beginning, middle, and end. This pattern is so common because it matches how we naturally understand change: a starting point, a period of struggle or development, and an outcome. In the beginning, we meet the key characters and the situation they're living in. We get a sense of their normal world, what life looks like before things shift. The beginning also plants important information and hints that will matter later. It's about orientation, helping the reader feel grounded in who and where we are. In the middle, pressure starts to build, problems grow, plans go wrong, new obstacles appear, and complications stack up. This is where tension lives. Characters are forced to respond, adapt, or make mistakes. The middle is where most of the emotional and dramatic weight sits. In the end, something resolves. Not always neatly, but meaningfully. Questions are answered, conflicts reach a turning point, and we see the result of choices made along the way. Most importantly, something has changed: the situation, the character, or the reader's understanding. It sounds simple: beginning, middle, end. But when each part is doing its job well, it creates a story that feels satisfying and complete. Structure sometimes gets a bad reputation because people hear the word and think, formula, but good structure isn't about forcing your story into a template. It's about clarity and intention. It helps you understand what your story is doing and where it's heading. Without structure, stories often start strongly, with a good idea or character, but then begin to wander. Scenes appear that are interesting but not connected. Energy drops. The thread gets loose. Structure helps keep the spine of the story intact. It also helps build emotional payoff. When events are arranged with purpose, when tension rises, choices matter, and consequences follow, the ending feels earned rather than accidental. Readers feel satisfied because the journey had shape and direction. From a writer's point of view, structure is also a practical tool. When you feel stuck, you can ask, where am I in the arc? What should be increasing right now? Pressure, stakes, conflict, revelation. It gives you a diagnostic method instead of guesswork. Think of structure like scaffolding around a building. It supports the construction while the creative work happens. You don't see it in the finished result, but without it, the build is much harder to hold steady. One of the most widely used story frameworks is the three-act structure. It shows up again and again across novels, films, theater, and even long-form TV, not because writers lack imagination, but because it mirrors how humans naturally process change and tension. At its core, the three-act structure breaks a story into three functional phases, not equal in length, but equal in purpose. Each act does a job in moving the story forward. Act 1. Setup. This is where we establish the character, the setting, and the starting situation. We understand what normal looks like, and then something happens that disrupts it. A problem appears, a discovery is made, a threat emerges, or an opportunity demands action. By the end of Act 1, the story has been set in motion and there's no easy way back. Act 2. Confrontation. This is the struggle phase. The character faces obstacles, resistance, and rising complications. Plans rarely work the first time. Stakes increase. Pressure builds. This act often contains reversals, surprises, and deeper challenges that test the character's ability and resolve. It's usually the longest section, because this is where growth and tension develop. Act 3. Resolution. This is where the story reaches its decisive moment. There's a final confrontation, turning point, or choice that determines the outcome. We see the consequences and the new reality that results. Loose ends are tied, or intentionally left open, but the central question of the story is answered. Once you start recognizing this pattern, you'll see it almost everywhere, and it becomes a very useful tool for shaping your own work. Act 1 is the setup phase. This is where we ground the reader in the character and their normal world. We see what everyday life looks like for them, how they think, what they value, and what their current situation is. This baseline matters, because later change only feels powerful if we understand what existed before. We're not just introducing a person, we're introducing a status quo. What is stable? What feels safe? What feels stuck? These details help the reader recognize what will be disrupted. Then comes what we call the inciting incident. The moment that disturbs that normal world. Something happens that creates a problem, an opportunity, or a threat. It might be dramatic. An accident, a discovery, a loss. Or it might be quiet but life-altering. A letter, a diagnosis, a job offer, a secret revealed. The key point is this. After the inciting incident, the character cannot simply continue as before. They are pushed, or pulled, into action. Even if they resist at first, the pressure is now there. The story has begun to move. A useful test for Act 1 is, could the character just ignore what happened and carry on comfortably? If yes, the inciting incident may not be strong enough yet. What kinds of events force characters to act rather than stay comfortable? Can you think of examples from stories or your own writing? Act 2 is usually the longest and most demanding part of the story, for both the character and the writer. This is the confrontation phase, where the real struggle happens. The initial problem introduced in Act 1 doesn't resolve quickly. Instead, it becomes more complex and more difficult. Obstacles increase. Each attempt to fix the situation tends to create new complications. Plans don't work as expected. Help falls through. Information is incomplete. Opposition pushes back. This is where the story earns its tension. Pressure should rise as we move through this act, not necessarily through constant action, but through increasing consequence. The character has more to lose, harder choices to make, and fewer easy options available. This is also where characters are tested internally. Their fears, flaws, habits, and blind spots show up. They often make mistakes, sometimes big ones. And those mistakes are useful because they drive the story forward and deepen realism. Perfect decisions make for flat stories. Flawed decisions create movement. You can think of Act 2 as a tightening spiral. Each turn raises the stakes and reduces the character's ability to avoid the core problem. By the time we approach Act 3, something has to give. If a story feels like it's sagging in the middle, it's often because the obstacles aren't escalating yet. They're repeating instead of intensifying. Act 3 is the resolution phase. This is where the story reaches its decisive turning point, and we see the outcome of everything that's been building so far. The tension that has been rising through Act 2 now comes to a head. Something must be faced, decided, revealed, or overcome. There is usually a final confrontation, or crucial decision. That doesn't always mean a physical showdown. It could be an emotional truth spoken, a sacrifice made, a a choice between two difficult options, or a moment of acceptance. What matters is that the central conflict is directly engaged rather than avoided. After this turning point, we see the consequences. Actions have results. Choices carry weight. The reader understands what the struggle has led to, and what the new reality looks like for the character. Most importantly, we understand what changed, externally, internally, or both. Perhaps the world is different, perhaps the character is different, perhaps the reader's understanding is different. Change is what makes an ending feel meaningful. Not all endings are neat or happy, and they don't have to be, but they should feel earned. That means the outcome grows naturally from what came before. It shouldn't feel random, rushed, or disconnected from the journey. A good test is this. If you look back at the beginning and compare it to the end, can you clearly see the shift? If yes, the resolution is doing its job. Another well-known story framework is the hero's journey. When I say hero's journey, I don't mean Superman, no cape required. In story structure terms, the hero is simply the main character. The one who is pushed out of their comfort zone, faces difficulty, and comes out changed. This model comes from the study of myths and legends across many cultures, where researchers noticed that transformation stories often follow a similar pattern. Different settings, different characters, but a surprisingly similar journey underneath. At its heart, the hero's journey is about transformation through challenge. A character begins in their normal world, something calls them out of it. They face a series of trials and setbacks, and they return, or emerge, changed in some meaningful way. What makes this structure powerful is that it mirrors real human growth. We leave comfort, face difficulty, learn through struggle, and come back with new understanding or strength. That's why it resonates so widely with readers and audiences. You'll often see the hero's journey in fantasy and adventure stories, but it also appears in modern drama, memoir-style narratives, coming-of-age stories, and even quiet literary fiction. The scale can be epic or very personal. The key element is inner and outer change through a journey of challenge. You don't have to use every stage of the model exactly, but understanding the pattern gives you another lens for shaping a character's development arc. You don't need to memorize every formal stage name in the hero's journey model. There are versions with 12 stages, 17 stages, and everything in between. What matters more is understanding the overall flow of transformation. It usually begins in the ordinary world, where we see the character's normal life and limitations. Then comes a call to adventure, an invitation, disruption, or demand that pulls them towards something unfamiliar. Sometimes they resist at first, which is very human, but eventually they step across a threshold into new territory. From there come the trials, tests, obstacles, allies, enemies, and learning experiences. This is where skills develop, beliefs are challenged, and confidence is shaken or strengthened. The character is stretched beyond their comfort zone. Then we reach a crisis or ordeal, a major turning point where the stakes are highest and something significant must be faced or risked. This moment often forces in a change, as well as outer action. Finally, there is the return changed phase. The character comes back, or moves forward, carrying new insight, strength, or perspective. They are not the same person we met at the start. So at its core, the hero's journey is a transformation arc, not just about what the character does, but about who they become through the journey. An important point to stress here: structure is a guide, not a cage. It's a tool for awareness, not a rulebook you must obey line by line. The purpose of learning structure is not to make every story look the same. It's to give you more control over how your story works. You can bend structure by shifting the order of events. You can compress it by telling a full arc in a very short space. You can stretch it by slowing key moments down. You can play with it through multiple timelines or viewpoints. You can even subvert it by deliberately breaking expectations, as long as you understand what expectation you're breaking and why. Writers who understand structure have more freedom, not less, because their choices are deliberate. They know when they're following a pattern and when they're deviating from it for effect. Think of it like learning musical scales before improvising. The knowledge doesn't limit creativity, it supports stronger creative decisions. So don't treat structure as something that restricts your voice. Treat it as something that strengthens your storytelling control. Conflict is one of the true engines of story. Without conflict, there's very little movement. Things may happen, but nothing pushes, nothing forces change. And without change, narrative energy drops. Conflict is what creates story momentum and tension. It puts pressure on characters, it forces decisions. It exposes weaknesses, values, and priorities. When a character wants something and something stands in the way, that friction creates story energy. Conflict can be external, against another person, a system, a situation, nature, time, or circumstance. A rival, a court case, a storm, a deadline, a failing business. Anything outside the character creating resistance. But conflict can also be internal, and this is often where the emotional depth lives. Fear, guilt, doubt, shame, anger, grief, divided loyalty. These inner struggles can be just as powerful as any external threat. Sometimes the outer problem is really just a mirror of the inner one. The strongest stories usually contain both outer conflict that creates action and inner conflict that creates meaning. The character is fighting something outside and something inside at the same time. That combination gives a story layers. Which do you personally find more interesting to read or write, inner conflict or outer conflict, and why? Stakes are what make a reader care about the outcome of a story. They answer the key question, why does this matter? When we talk about stakes, we're asking, what happens if the character fails? What is genuinely at risk here? What could be lost, damaged, or changed in a way that matters? The clearer and more meaningful the risk, the stronger the reader's emotional investment. Stakes don't have to be world-ending to be powerful. They can be deeply personal. A relationship, a reputation, a sense of identity, safety, belonging, or self-respect. A quiet story can still have high emotional stakes if the consequence feels real and significant to the character. It also helps if the stakes are visible to the reader. If the risk is vague or distant, tension drops. But when readers understand the possible cost and believe it could truly happen, tension rises naturally. A useful check when revising is to ask, what does this scene risk for the character? If the honest answer is not much, the scene may need the stakes clarified or raised. Because if nothing important is at risk, readers don't feel tension, and tension is what keeps them leaning forward. Let's make this practical with a quick exercise on raising stakes. Take a simple scenario. She might lose her job. That gives us a problem, but the emotional intensity is still fairly mild. Many readers will think, that's unfortunate, but they won't necessarily feel urgent concern yet. Now let's raise the stakes by increasing the consequences. If losing her job means she also loses her home, or can no longer support her child, or risks deportation, or loses access to medical care, suddenly the emotional weight increases. The core situation hasn't changed, but the impact has. And impact is what creates tension. You can raise stakes by asking layered questions. Who else is affected by this outcome? What secondary loss could follow the first loss? What personal fear does this trigger? What does this threaten that the character values most? Another useful technique is to connect outer stakes to inner stakes. It's not just losing the job, it's confirming their deepest fear that they're a failure, or proving a critic right, or repeating a past trauma. That combination multiplies tension. When you're reviewing your own story, whether it's a short piece or a full draft, it helps to have a simple structure check tool. Think of this as a quick diagnostic you can run to see whether your narrative has a clear spine. These questions help you step back and look at the story as a whole, rather than line by line. Question 1. What changes? By the end of the story, what is different from the beginning? Is it the character, the situation, a relationship, a belief, or a piece of knowledge? If nothing has changed, the story may feel static, even if lots of events happened. Question 2. What forces that change? What actually creates the shift? A conflict, a discovery, a loss, a choice, pressure from outside, pressure from inside. Change should be caused, not accidental. Readers want to see the chain of cause and effect. Question 3. Where is the turning point? Can you point to the moment where things can't go back to how they were? The pivot moment, the confrontation, revelation, or decision that redirects the outcome. If you can't find it, the story may need a clearer peek. Question 4. What decision matters most? Which choice carries the greatest consequence? Strong stories often hinge on a meaningful decision, not just an event that happens, but an action the character chooses. Choice creates emotional weight and ownership. If you can answer these 4 questions clearly, your story structure is probably working. If one answer is fuzzy, that's often the exact place to revise, not by adding more words, but but by sharpening the narrative spine. Now we're going to turn everything we've discussed into a quick practical exercise, a story mapping exercise. This isn't about polished writing. It's about seeing the shape of your narrative clearly. Think of it as drawing the skeleton, not the finished body. I'd like you to write 3 short sections. Just notes or bullet points, not full sentences unless you want to. Keep it simple and structural. Beginning. Situation. What is the starting situation? Who is the character? What is their normal world like? What is happening just before things change? Middle. Main conflict. What is the central problem or pressure? What obstacle or struggle drives the story forward? What gets harder or more complicated? End. Outcome or change. What happens as a result? What is resolved or what shifts? What is different by the end, in the character or the situation? Bullet points are absolutely fine. This is a map, not prose. You're not trying to sound literary here. You're trying to see clearly. If you already have a story in progress, map that. If not, invent a simple one. Even a very small, personal-scale story works perfectly for this. I'll give you about 8 to 10 minutes for this. Don't overthink it. Clarity beats cleverness here. If you get stuck, just ask yourself, what changes from start to finish? Let's finish by pulling together the key ideas from today, because these are principles you can reuse again and again, no matter what genre or length you're writing in. First, strong stories have shape. They move from a starting point to an ending point with purpose. Even experimental or non-linear stories still have an underlying arc of change or escalation. When you can see the shape, you can strengthen the story. Second, conflict creates motion. It's the engine of narrative. When something resists the character, externally or internally, the story moves forward. Without conflict, scenes may be pleasant or interesting, but they won't generate momentum. Third, stakes create investment. Readers engage when outcomes matter. When something meaningful could be lost, gained, revealed, or broken, tension rises naturally. Clear stakes make readers lean in. Fourth, change creates meaning. By the end of a story, something should be different. A belief, a relationship, a situation, a self-understanding. Change is what turns a sequence of events into a narrative experience. And finally, structure doesn't remove creativity, it supports it. Think of structure as a support system, not a restriction. It helps your ideas land with more clarity, more impact, and more emotional payoff. You bring the originality, structure helps deliver it effectively. Next week we'll build on what we've covered today about structure and conflict, and focus on how narrative works at the scene level, the moment-to-moment experience for the reader. We'll look at how to balance action, description, and reflection, because strong storytelling isn't just about what happens, but how it's presented on the page. Too much action, without grounding, can feel rushed and shallow. Too much description can slow the pace. Too much reflection can stall momentum. We'll explore how to blend the three, so your scenes feel alive and purposeful. We'll also work on managing tension and release. Stories can't stay at full intensity all the time. Readers need variation in pace and emotional pressure. You'll learn how to build tension, when to let it breathe, and how controlled release actually makes the next tense moment more powerful. Think of it like rhythm, tightening and loosening at the right moments. And we'll focus on keeping narratives engaging across the whole piece, not just at the beginning. We'll look at techniques that maintain reader interest, micro-questions, scene goals, emotional turns, and forward pull. The subtle signals that make a reader want to keep going. Bring a short piece or scene with you next week if you can. We'll use it to test pacing and engagement techniques in real time.